Okay, everyone, out of respect for everybody's time, we're going to go ahead and get going, let people join as they are able to. So my name is Laura, and I'm a part of the team at Revelry. And we are really glad you're here today. I'll be facilitating today's event. And I just want to start by saying we're really glad you're here. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. 8 questions business leaders should ask before jumping into AI. And we're really looking forward to having 2 amazing experts with us who are going to talk a little bit about some of the things the Revelry team has learned as it's been kind of playing, for lack of better words, with this emerging technology. Before I hand things off to our presenters, just 2 quick notes. One, we are recording today's webinar, so just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. And then secondly, said recorded webinar will be shared with each and every one of you tomorrow via email. So be sure to keep an eye open for that. Without further ado, I will introduce today's speakers. Okay. First off, we have Heather Bourdaux. She is the VP of Strategic Initiatives at Revelry, based out of New Orleans. She's been a part of our team for a little bit over a year and brings incredible expertise in strategic planning and program management. Personally, I've got to say she's one of my favorite people. She is New Orleans girl through and through. She is a lover of all things travel and music and cooking. And I heard her say once, it's always stuck with me, she's never met a biscuit she didn't love. So if you ever get an opportunity to be in the same space as Heather, keep that in mind. Next up, we have Jason Pollentier. Jason has been a part of our engineering team for several years, since 2017. He's one of our directors at this point. He has so many areas of expertise, but Elixir for certain. And I've noticed also he's just kind of the go-to for all the questions on all of the back-end software development, product development questions. He is super into cycling and rock climbing and has called New Orleans home for a long time. So, and then just briefly, you've met Heather, you've met Jason, meet Revelry. This is the organization that we are fortunate to be a part of, and the reason for this opportunity to gather today. Revelry's been around for about 10 years. We're a product strategy, design, and development company based in New Orleans, but we have clients nationwide. We are super proud to be a values-led company, and I think this is in part why we were recently recognized as a top workplaces winner. We work across a variety of industries, but have some really deep experience in healthcare, logistics, finance, consumer, and software as a service. A quick glimpse at some of the companies we are fortunate to call partners. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Heather. Heather, welcome.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the kind intro. And thanks everyone for joining. I want to start by sharing our agenda for the next hour. We're going to start broad, setting the table with the AI market as a whole, then talking about the generative AI market. And I'll spend about 20 minutes total on the questions that'll help you formulate your AI strategy. And then Jason's going to spend about 20 minutes talking about AI from an engineering perspective. Along the way, we'll both share some suggestions for how to go about answering the questions, why we think they're important, and layer in some examples from our own experiences. I'm not sure if Laura mentioned it or not, but if you have questions, drop them in the chat, please. All right, jumping in, let's look at the AI market. When most people today think of AI or artificial intelligence, they're thinking of just LLMs or large language models. That's what's in the news right now. That's what's grabbing the headlines. So that's why there's that association. ChatGPT, Bard, Claude, Anthropic, all examples of large language models. But AI is a lot broader. It includes things like machine learning, which are algorithms designed to improve and adapt their performance through exposure to new data, like recommendations that improve and change with your behavior. Think about your Netflix queue, Instacart, Instagram, all of these things that respond to how you are responding to the recommendations. There's also computer vision, which enables software to derive information from images, facial recognition on your iPhone, for example. There's language processing or NLP and tons more. A recent report says that the global AI market is expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate, which is really hard to say, of 36.8% over the next 7 years. Wow. It's the result of 3 factors converging: data availability. So think of the breadth and the depth of accessible public data these days and what's been growing over the last decade or two. Advancement in algorithms and computing power. Now, shifting to the generative AI market. Generative AI refers to types of artificial intelligence that are capable of generating new content. So text, artwork, music, videos, again, a lot of the things that you're hearing in the headlines today. This market, the generative AI market, is projected to reach almost 200 billion in essentially the next 10 years. I mean, again, let that sink in. But more so, 93% of companies plan to spend on AI in the next 12 months. That's the stat that compelled us to do the webinar. We want to help you figure out how to get started. All right, here's a visual glance of the generative AI market. And I want to call out 2 things before we really jump into it. One, it's courtesy of Sequoia Capital, so thank you. And as is the next visual that we'll look at. And this was published 6 months ago. I'm confident that this landscape has doubled or maybe even tripled in that time, just progressing at a wild rate. This is just to give you a sense of what's out there, or at least what was out there as of 6 months ago. And also what you're looking at here are just the companies that were within the text and video segments at that point. This slide shows the categories in things like image and speech. Also, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of this type of constant growth, there's a daily e-newsletter out there that many of the Revelry crews subscribe to. It's called Ben's Bites. It's free. It's not at all affiliated with us. And there are just so many of them out there. It's a great way to just kind of stay informed. Prompt Box is one that I've recently gotten into too. Okay, so before we get caught up, or too caught up rather, in all of this new stuff, and just in case you're feeling overwhelmed, just remember that AI isn't entirely new. It's just evolving. I've already touched on a few things you're familiar with, like product recommendations and facial recognition. Here are a few others that I think you're probably using in your daily life. Virtual assistants like Siri or Alexa, a navigation app, Waze and Google Maps. Okay, now that we've set the stage, let's dig in. AI is here and it's not going away. Why is it important to get involved? I want to quote NYU professor and industry expert Scott Galloway. AI is not going to take your job. Someone who understands AI is going to take your job. So get good at it. And this is really just to say we as business leaders need to understand it and figure out how to best leverage it for our own businesses. We need to take control and get ahead of it. All right, we know AI can support business in at least 3 specific ways: improving operational efficiency, enhancing customer experiences, and driving innovation. And while AI itself doesn't drive innovation, it can augment our innovation processes in important ways. It can accelerate the pace, it can improve the quality, but let's get to the questions. Firstly, what do you know? What do you not know? Make sure you have enough information to make decisions about using AI. You don't have to be an expert, but get educated. Find out what your engineering team knows. I bet you have some AI experts in-house already. Pull them in. It's a great way to get grassroots enthusiasm and ideas that are specific to your own business. At Revelry, we started an AI Slack channel, and folks are still posting in it every single day, exchanging great information. Ben's Bites, as I mentioned earlier, that's another great way to learn about new things just on a very easy basis, having the information pushed to you. Secondly, what customer problems are you actively trying to solve? Rethink the solutions looking through the lens of AI. The cautionary tale here is don't buy a hammer looking for nails to hit. Apply the AI hammer and apply it to nails that you already know about, nails that need to be hit. Next, what are your operational inefficiencies? AI is a great option for accelerating and automating. Goldman Sachs, in fact, says that generative AI will boost US productivity by 1.5% per year over the next year. Not something to ignore. Next, how can you fit AI into your budget? If you've allocated to innovation in your tech or product roadmap budget, it's a natural application for it. And if you're not allocating to innovation, you absolutely should be. When I planned the tech portfolio for a major retailer out there, we allocated to innovation at the strategic level to be allocated if and when a good idea hit. We allocated to an ongoing stream of just new ideas that our teams had. And we also allocated at the team level itself to foster innovation within a specific customer domain. So a great practice to always remember. Okay, now that we've gone through those series of questions, you have an idea of what you might want to do. Start to ask yourself about the risks and the reward. Keep in mind, right, that at this point, it can be a risk not to get started. Even if it's getting started small, which of course is the best way to do it, especially when you're talking about or dealing with a technology like this that is changing at such a rapid rate. The keys here are to get informed, to make a plan, and to get started, get moving on that plan. Okay, let's not forget though, there are some things that need to happen before you build. And it's discovery, right? Don't skip discovery. Discovery is essential to any project. I think we all know that. Sometimes we forget it. But also, don't think discovery is about sequestered research, siloed activity, and documentation. Discovery is a team sport. Make sure your engineering partners and stakeholders are part of the process, as well as your end users, if that makes sense. Think of discovery as an ongoing process. Really test and learn in every single phase. Okay, hopefully this has been helpful so far. Jason, I'll turn it over to you to talk about AI from the engineering perspective.
Thanks, Heather. So since we've recently been doing some work on AI-oriented products for Revelry, I'm going to share some details about some engineering questions that we ran into and how we answered them for our product. I'm sure it'll be quite different from what you experience, but hopefully sharing the thought processes will help you to approach your own situation. So the first engineering-oriented question, the sixth overall, is what will be your anchor technologies? So to build anything in this area, you're going to be making a lot of technology choices. We saw in one of the previous slides, two of the previous slides, that there are a lot of things out there. So I think it's important to approach those choices with an internal understanding of how central each of those choices is to your project. And you're going to want to think both technologically and business implications when you look at those options. So I like to think of this in terms of the type 1 and type 2 decisions that Jeff Bezos made famous. So a type 1 decision is your anchor technology. That's a choice that once you start down this path, you're going to find it hard to change course, right? It's a hard to reverse choice. Whereas type 2 decision, I think of as a softer bet. That's something that you can change your mind on later, and it doesn't cause a whole reorganization of your efforts. You can do that. So you don't really want to agonize over these type 2 decisions, these softer bets. And you really also don't want to take these type 1 decisions, your anchor technologies, without really giving it some consideration. So one of the things that happened in our transition from just playing around to deciding we were going to build a product was that we had been prototyping using a JavaScript-based stack because it made using certain tools really easy. And when we got down to building an actual app around that, we realized that the choice of the software stack that was going to hold it all together and coordinate everything was actually an anchor technology choice. We were going to be stuck with that, or else it was going to be painful to replace. So we decided to reverse course a little bit, use those JavaScript-based prototypes as inspiration, and start our real app in the stack that we're most comfortable in, which is Elixir and Phoenix with a Postgres database. So not AI-specific stuff. And these are the technologies that we're really good at. And they have a lot of qualities that we like concurrency and fault tolerance. And that way we feel confident that our anchor technology is going to support us through our whole journey. The things that we knew less about, that we were less sort of sure about, are our softer bets. And those are the AI things. Those are the things that are changing rapidly and that we knew less about. So we're working with OpenAI and Pinecone as our machine learning provider and our vector database. And those are things that we're going to build our system so we can swap those out with something else later when we learn more, when the need arises. If you are familiar with some of this stuff, you may have guessed that the reason we were in JavaScript was because we wanted to use LangChain. LangChain is kind of a Swiss Army knife that makes it easy to slap together things like large language models, vector databases, and then other data sources like a GitHub repo or PDFs. And it's really great for prototyping. It's really great for learning what kinds of things these technologies can do and seeing how people think about them. But when we thought about actually building an app on top of LangChain, it really started to cause some friction. So the architecture isn't really our style. There's a lot of things we wanted to poke at or change that were kind of buried deep in their object-oriented hierarchies. And it felt like a lot of the engineering effort that went into LangChain, and part of what makes it so great is that it's universal, right? You can plug anything into it and it's very abstract. But we're building one thing, and there's a best way for us to do that for our app, for our needs. And so we didn't want to take on all that extra complexity. As far as the stack, there were things that can definitely be done in whatever stack you're using, but things that we already know how to do really, really well in our chosen stack that we were struggling more than we should have been with. So we are doing lots of background processing and concurrent things happening throughout the app. And we have user interfaces that want to be sort of keyed into those events so the user can see what's going on. And that's something that is really straightforward for us with the stack we're familiar with. And the sort of basic example of that is just very simply, if you're getting some generated text back from a large language model, you like to see it streaming onto the screen as it comes back from the model, right? And that was super trivial in our Elixir and Phoenix stack. So we did end up having to rewrite some things that we could have gotten for free from LangChain. It wasn't a terrible amount of effort, and we learned through it. So I think that ultimately we're happy that we can take that code now in our own direction, and that we're not beholden to having this piece of code at the center of our app that was just the first thing we latched onto, right? So that's how we talked about anchor technologies and softer bets. Another question that's always going to come up with technology is, what should you build on your own and what should you buy? So I think when thinking about this, I think it's important to think about the different kinds of models, and I'm going to drastically simplify things here and just draw a distinction between the large language models that are generating text and pretty much everything else, which I'm just going to call traditional machine learning. So if what you're doing is about understanding human language and producing human language, then the large language models perform really well out of the box. And that's going to be the most likely entry point for a brand new venture. If the problem that you're trying to solve can be solved by understanding and generating text, then you're going to be looking at large language models. If you're doing something where you want to ingest gigabytes of your own data and analyze that or make some predictions, then I would classify that on the other end where you're doing more traditional machine learning. And that's something that's going to be much less accessible off the shelf, right? Because OpenAI and Facebook are training models based on the knowledge out on the internet, and that's where we get our large language models. They don't have access to your business metrics that you want to use machine learning on. So you're not going to find a model that understands that already. It is interesting to note that the context windows for large language models are growing as the field progresses. And what that means is that when you give your model its prompt, its instructions, you can also feed a lot of other information in there with it. And sometimes that can reduce the need for training or fine tuning, because the model can understand a little bit of your specific problem just by the information you pass to it. And the other thing that's really interesting is that these large language models can be made to understand and generate structured documents. So you can do something if you want, like pass a data structure in JSON and ask the model to do something and ask it to give you a CSV back. So there might be some things that are sort of maybe in the gray area between pure language stuff and pure machine learning number crunching and predicting that an LLM might be suitable for, or might become suitable for in the near future. And the other sort of distinction that we might draw when we're thinking about build versus buy is that there are really two pieces of the puzzle. The first is building and training the model, and the second is running the model to create your sort of production outputs, right? And here we have some really rough descriptions of the options for each of those. And again, the type of model matters a lot. If you're doing more traditional machine learning, you're most likely to have to at least do some fine tuning, if not train the model, if not even design your own model. And if you're doing an LLM, where you don't really have the option to train that from scratch or design it from scratch unless you have the kind of data that some of these huge companies have. So the options are a little limited depending on what you're doing. As far as running the model, you can really go all the way up or down. You can consume an API from OpenAI where it's just like a non-machine learning API, right? It's just like calling Stripe or Twilio API. You can do something in the middle where you're renting some hardware from AWS or GCP and running either an open source model, maybe a fine-tuned model, maybe something you came up with from scratch. And of course, you can run on your own hardware in your own data center if you have the stomach for it. Generally, the more you do on your own, the more investment you're going to have to put in. And so you're going to be investing, the more you do, you're going to be investing in machine learning expertise. You might be investing in gathering and preparing your data if you want to do any training. And then hardware, of course, whether you are running your own hardware or renting it, then that's another investment. And of course, there's a time investment in all of this, bringing the expertise and the capability online. An interesting thing about the hardware side is that the economics are a little bit counterintuitive in some ways. You would think that the more prepackaged something is, the more expensive it would be on a per unit basis. And then by buying in bulk or buying your own and running your own, you save money. And that's not going to be so true on the AI specific hardware always, because the hardware, you need to pay for it over many uses. And if you're just getting started, it's going to be very hard to utilize that hardware fully. Whereas if you're getting an API calls to OpenAI, well, they're not only burning a bunch of VC cash, but they're also able to utilize their hardware much more efficiently than we could with such a smaller scale and lower volume. So it's probably not surprising that where we ended in this build or buy is that for now, we are buying everything. We're just making API calls to OpenAI. We're storing our vector data in Pinecone. And that's allowed us to move fast. It's allowed us to prove out ideas and deliver some value for our internal software delivery teams. We made soft bets on those. So we do think that that's not going to be the state of play forever. We are learning in the background more and more about different models, different ways to run these things, alternate vector databases, all that kind of stuff. And we think that most likely the thing that will cause us to sort of take that step with our app will be concerns about privacy and security, right? So if you're sending the data to OpenAI, then you are limited in the kinds of data that you can operate on and the kinds of customers that you can serve. So that's definitely on our radar, and it's a place that we're going to be exercising the softness of those bets. The last question from the engineering perspective is around how we're going to evaluate how we're doing, right? So this comes up both on the micro level and a macro level. So on the micro level, we can think about whether a particular model or prompt or sort of AI agent workflow, whatever it is actually meeting the needs of our systems users, whether the outputs we're generating and the outcomes that we're creating are the ones we wanted, and how well we're achieving those goals. And on the macro level, we can think about we can think about whether the project as a whole is achieving its goals. So we may be generating great outputs, but we may actually be taking more time when our goal was what that means for our business as well. And as far as getting into details on the evaluation, I can't say too much about a particular business's goals and why you might set out on your particular project, except just to say that it is a good idea to think about what constitutes success, how you'll measure that, and when you'll evaluate how you've done and, course correct. Ideally, when you're doing discovery, those things are being discussed, right? If you set out to build something, you have an idea. The hope is that when we deploy this, it will have this effect. So if this stuff is so amorphous at the beginning that you're still exploring, which is definitely was the case for us when we were starting out, it's never too late to stop and decide to bring in some discussions about how to evaluate that. On the detail side, the micro evaluations of individual outputs, there are a lot of folks building tools, both open source and commercial, for this kind of thing. I think that it's a pretty green field. There's nothing that just solves it across the board. It's kind of emerging, but some of the things that have been on my radar are something called chainforge.ai. There's one called uptrain.ai, and a more of a sort of GitHub developer tool called promptfoo.dev. And finally, a lot of the stuff, especially if you're working with human language, is going to be subjective. So if you're not sure how to measure that kind of thing, I encourage checking out this book, How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. It has a lot of really great, both conceptual and practical ideas for dealing with that kind of problem. How to take something as amorphous as, okay, the tool wrote a blog post, is it any good, into something that you can quantify and track. As far as what we have done along these lines, I have to say that it's a place where we haven't gone as far as we'd liked, as we would have liked. We've built some tools where we can generate batches of outputs based on the same inputs and sort of score and compare which configuration resulted in the outputs that we like the most. But we haven't really systematized that and started tracking it and making adjustments. So we're still working on that. And I hope we get into it a little more. I think that's all I had for the evaluation step. And I think now Laura's going to take over and get some of your questions.
I just wanted to jump in really quick, add that from that evaluation perspective, like, what are you doing? That when you're thinking about budgeting, you may need to think and for those of tool investment, those type of tools as well, or user testing that is specific to that. So it's really a consideration up front as well that I probably should have called out. Laura?
Yes. Thank you, guys. Thank you both for your expertise, your time, your energy, and all of the great information. I do have two. There is nothing on chat yet on the question side, but I have two that were shared with me earlier today that I promised to pass along. And so the first one is, what AI tools specifically is Revelry's engineering team using?
Yeah, well, the obvious ones are the code assistant tools. I think that was one of the first boxes on that first Sequoia slide. But the ones that I've seen in use at Revelry are, of course, GitHub Copilot. That's sort of the biggest, most obvious one. And some folks love it and swear by it. Others are not sure. And the other one that I've seen and heard good things about is Cody from SourceGraph. And the interesting thing about that product is that SourceGraph GitHub is obviously in the game. They host code. They're owned by Microsoft. SourceGraph has spent a long time working on search and indexing and understanding code bases. And so they've been able to bring that expertise into building an AI coding assistant. So those are the two big ones from the engineering side. I know that the folks who are more on the visual side have used some other tools for generating images. And I think that the ones I've heard most about there are Midjourney, and there's something from Adobe, I think Firefly. So those have been super useful as well.
Wonderful.
I'll just add that we have also recently built something that our teams are just starting to use, and as our teams outside of Revelry, and that's been really exciting as well, not just for engineers, but for others within software development teams. And lastly, I'll just add that I personally just tend to go to ChatGPT. I mean, my needs are very simple. They're very text-based, and I happen to have a subscription. So that's where I go.
Great. Thank y'all. The second question, and I'm not sure which of you, or maybe both of you, this is most appropriate for, but when you talk about the risks of AI, how do you decide where to invest?
I mean, Jason, I'll let you talk about the technical risks, the things having to do with security, et cetera. And but one thing that jumps to my mind is sometimes it's better to start internally. So rather than starting with something using AI in a customer-facing way, look at some way that you could apply it internally to something that isn't going to give you a big exposure, an internal process, a small internal group of employees that can minimize your risk in a different way, and then also give you learnings that you can then apply elsewhere. So that's how I would answer it.
Yeah, I think on the technology side, obviously, I think that what I talked about with making softer bets on the things that are less certain and moving faster is part of risk mitigation. And that's one of the things that I always have in the back of my mind when I'm making technology decisions is how likely am I to regret this? And so that's one thing. I think on the security side, it's best to start internal. It's best to be careful and just be really clear about what's happening. And then finally, I think that, there's a lot of concern about exposing users to undesirable output. I think the filters have gotten pretty good on the very high profile models, but I do hear a lot of people talking about making sure that there's a layer of logic between the language model and the user in some situations. If the language model is going to be making decisions that could have a large impact, whether that's answering a question from a customer who seems irate and has a really high monthly spend or something like that, or if it's taking a destructive action, inside a chat, you're going to want to put safeguards in there. And some of the tools around getting the AIs to call functions and return structured output can sort of allow you to build that layer in between. So.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions. And so just take a moment to thank Jason and Heather again. Thank you for all of this. Such good information. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. A reminder, we will be sharing out this recording tomorrow via email. And y'all have a good one. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.